Alrighty, what I'm going to do is just introduce you to our upcoming internal, which is called 2.7, Significant Connections. So I'll just talk you through a little bit of the basics, the marking criteria, and briefly through an example just to give you an overview of the standard and hopefully make you kind of familiar with it. So the basics of this, you would have done the level 1 version of this last year. It was called 1.8. So most of you will be pretty familiar with this internal, how it looks, what factors into it. The main difference between this version and last year's is that last year you just had to find one significant connection, which was likely just one theme, and this year you need two. Generally, you have an overarching connection, and then you just look at two different ways that that connection's shown, or two different aspects of how that connection's shown. I'll talk through that a little bit more at a later date. What you're ultimately going to do is produce a report, or depending on how your teacher's structuring it, answer some questions or fill in a grid that reflects your understanding of a common connection across 4 texts that you have read or viewed this year. It can be anything that is at a suitable level that you have read, or it can be something you have viewed. So it can be something like a short story or a poem, but it can also be something like a film. For my class, our class's overarching connection is man and his environment. So we've got texts that all show different ways that humans or mankind interact with their environment and have influences on it and are influenced by it. So what you can do in terms of texts that are covered is 3 of those can be studied texts, which means you have talked about it lots in class, you've analysed it, you've watched it, you've read it, you've pulled out details, you've talked about it. But one of those texts has to be self-selected. That means you have to pick it. But pretty much all teachers will make sure that there are texts that you can self-select from, that they know are relevant, that they know fit with your theme or connection, and they know are going to be at the level required. You can do your own thing, but obviously you want to run that past the teacher first to check that it is suitable. The other key part of this assessment is making sure that you have specific supporting evidence about how the connection's shown. So that's 2 parts of the criteria. So the criteria looks a little bit like this, and I'm going to run you through all those aspects in a moment. So the phrasing of the criteria is that you are assessed on your ability to analyse significant connections across texts supported by evidence, and how well you do that will determine whether you get achieved merit or excellence. So these are just some of the clarifying details about what it takes. So this one is just telling you what analyse significant connections means, and goes through those other bits for merit and excellence, but I'll talk you through those in a little bit more clearer language. This is a bit assessment heavy, so I'll try to talk you through that in a moment. And this is just some other clarifying details on what significant connections are. So it's any connection that's important or significant, and that can be related to the purpose of the text, the ideas, the language features, the structures. Most of the time we go with ideas because they're nice and simple. It just goes through some more clarifying details around what supporting evidence means, but I'll talk about that in a second. And it just says that you have to have at least 4 texts. One has to be student selected, and they can be any combination of written, visual, or oral text. So I'm just going to talk you through this criteria. Hopefully that makes it rather straightforward for you. The first key word that might need some clarification is the word analyse. So this one comes up in our essays all the time, so you might be familiar with it, but you might be a little bit questionable on it. So analyse means that you're going to look into it in detail, and you're going to discuss something and you're going to interpret it. So you're going to look at your connection, you're going to look at it in detail, think about what it shows you, how it's shown, why it's shown, what it makes you think, what it makes you feel, why it might be important. That's the sort of thing that you will be scaffolded and helped into thinking about, but that's what you do all the time in English. You probably don't even realise you're doing it. Supported by evidence refers to having specific details from the text. The easiest way to think about that is having quotations and techniques and scenes and events you're going to be talking about. What makes the difference to move from just doing this to doing this convincingly? So this is the merit criteria. To be convincing, your explanation or your analysis or your discussion has to be developed. So really thoughtful, not just one sentence or two sentences of analysis. You've gone into further detail. You've given it reasons or justifications or good explanations. It's a bit more thoughtful. It's a bit more detailed. So if you look at the exemplars either online or in your booklet, you'll come to see the sort of difference between what gets achieved and that little bit more detail for merit. And finally, excellence is the way that excellence always is. So you've got to be perceptive. Perceptive means insightful. So you've got thoughts that are quite interesting, they're thought provoking, they're quite intelligent, or they're original. So it's clear that you're not just reciting something that your teachers told you, but you've actually thought on it in a little bit more detail. You've maybe thought about how the director or author has positioned us. You've thought a little bit about the impacts. You've connected it to the world. You can see how this is similar to other aspects of the world. Maybe you've managed to link your text together in quite a thoughtful way. You've compared how they're shown, that sort of thing. It's just intelligent details that help you get to excellence. So this is just a summary. You might want to pause and make a note, particularly for the grade that you have as a goal that you are aiming for. So the basics to getting achieved, you've got to discuss your four texts. You've got to describe the connection, how it's shown. So whatever that connection is, it's going to be a theme or something. Provide evidence. You've got to analyze what that connection shows. So you've said this text shows us this. Here's an example of it. Here's how that example shows what I've said it does. And then you're going to think about why it shows that, what you can learn from it, just a little bit of extra detail. Ideally, you're then going to try and connect it to another text. You didn't really have to do that at level 1, but level 2, it's really going to help you get over the line. And you want to think about different ways that that connection is shown. So our overarching connection for our class is man versus the environment, or man and his environment. So in some texts, humans impact nature, and in some texts, nature impacts humans, or the environment impacts the humans. So it's just thinking about different ways that it's shown. If you're aiming for merits, you need to have the same stuff from achieved, but you need to think a little bit more about the creator's purpose, a little bit deeper thoughts for your analysis, and a little bit more developed explanation, discussion, reasoning, just a bit more detail and thought overall. And if you are aiming for excellence, insightful reflections, depth of discussion, connections to the wider world, connections to self, society, personal engagement, your reflections, what you've learned, and they all need to be just a little bit more detailed and thoughtful. You might be considering how the author or director has used film techniques or language features to help to explore or position or go through that connection. So this one is a little bit harder, but it's definitely not out of reach if you are engaging with your. So the last thing I want to finish off on in this introduction is just to show you an extract from I think this is a high merit or a merit, low merit, merit regardless, paragraph. So this one is in the booklet, and it is their connection is alienation or outsiders. So this paragraph focuses on the idea of racism towards outsiders. So that's their connection as outsiders, and then their kind of like sub connection, or the way it's explored is through attitudes around racism. So I can't pronounce the name of the film, but we'll work through it. I'll just read through it and talk through it quickly. So if you feel confident in your understanding of the assessment now, that's all good. But if you want to just hear about it and how it works with an example, we'll just spend a couple of minutes now. In the short film Schwarzfahrer, there is blatant racism from the old woman towards the black man. But using the analogy that I brought up before, we can see the old woman would be representing the older generation of Germany, and its perception, it is their perception that has given this racist view of Negroes. Because of the changing world, the older generation feels insecure about their surroundings, and they take this out on outsiders. So this is them describing the connection of outsiders. There also can be a lot of patriotism associated with one's country, and the older generation feel as though these outsiders who have a different skin color are not part of their country and do not belong there. So that one in particular, that there is sort of analysis. This is their kind of convincing thoughts. It is these reasons that were demonstrated throughout Schwarzfahrer It caused people, in particular the older generation, to perceive people from other countries as outsiders and to have prejudices against them. So their supporting evidence there is talking about the old people and their attitude to the Negroes, as they've called them. If we look back to the 16th century, then it was common for not just the older generation, but the whole population to have racist views. So that's showing their ability to think about how the connection was impacted by the setting. So that one's a little bit more analysis. Then what they've tried to do, as you can see in my grey here, is they've tried to connect it to one of their other texts. In the play The Merchant of Venice, we can see that most of the population had racist views. These views are not caused by insecurities, but instead because there was a lack of knowledge about evolution and science. So religion played a much bigger part of people's lives than it does today. So this is showing their awareness of how the setting once again influenced the idea of racism, which impacts that idea of outsiders. The Jews were forced to wear a red hat to make them identifiable in public, and this is an important point because it implies that we should judge people based on their religion. So that's some analysis. Is it still relevant in a modern society as we see religious garments such as the burqa being banned in France? So they've tried to connect it to the real world. It's not really developed into insight yet, though. This is a huge contrast from the play because we are attempting to stop us stereotyping and putting labels on people and cultures. They don't really explain that. This would show that as a society, we have developed much from the 16th century, and we have now begun to stop racism and stereotyping that was such a big part of life in Venice. But they haven't really explained that, and they kind of contradict themselves. If we look at the motion picture, so they've tried to connect again. The Hurt Locker, we can still see examples of racism, and it would appear as though racism and conflict go hand in hand. So that last idea is quite thoughtful, but if they'd taken it a little bit further and explained it, that would be more convincing. So this gets merit because they've got some good thoughts about the patriotism and how that impacts them, and how lack of knowledge and lack of knowledge and religion play an influencing part on people's attitudes to outsiders. So that's the stuff there and kind of there that really helps to make it scrape into that merit category. So you can see a little bit of thought. They're not just saying, here's an example, here's how it shows it, but they've thought about why and how it shows it. So that's what takes you to merit. So hopefully you can see a little bit of that connection. I'd recommend going back through the criteria again and making sure that you're super familiar. But otherwise, there we go, 2.7, connections. Hope that all makes sense. Bye.